all hear terrible stories of innocent women being waylaid and murdered by complete strangers as they walk home in the dark. But is this really the norm or a macabre urban myth? Oddly enough, your chances of inadvertently crossing the River Styx occur in the home, and by someone you actually know. Most of the time, the perpetrator is a man who claims that he never intended to murder the victim. Whether there was malice or forethought is up to the jury to decide. What is so extraordinary about this tale is that the proceeds of crime were insignificant to modern eyes. Only a cheap gold watch and a pair of binoculars were stolen and hidden in the murderer's garden. Today we frequently hear the phrase, "when a pound was a pound." You could buy a fair range of goods in 1950 with a pound note and still get change, but you could not buy a suit or a radio with it. Ted Woodfield was an ordinary working man who lived in the Horfield area of Bristol and used to work in the Bristol Aeroplane Company in Filton. He suffered from dermatitis, or eczema as it is commonly called. This covered his face, and he was subject to remarks by colleagues that he had venereal disease. As a result of these taunts, he left the company. When he tried to return, he was told that there was no vacancies. At the time of the murder, he was unemployed. Over to you, James, to tell the story.
This episode concerns events that occurred in Horfield, a residential area just to the north of Bristol city centre. At the time, the West Country city was a busy harbour and trading centre, attracting goods from all around the world. 65-year-old widow Ethel Worth lived in a quiet side street called Hewenden Road, which she shared with her 40-year-old son Frederick. It was an area that she knew well, having been born and brought up in the district. The 20th of September 1950 was an ordinary Wednesday, and Ethel's son went off to work at the Bristol Airplane Company in Filton, a nearby industrial location, returning at lunchtime, as he regularly did, for some food. Having pottered around the house in the morning, Ethel would often have an afternoon nap in the living room, and that day was no exception. When Fred returned to work, she settled down in a chair in front of the fire. Fred returned at his usual time of 5:30 in the afternoon, shouting a hello to his mother as he came through the front door, but receiving no reply, he went into the living room and was surprised to see his mother in her favourite chair with her head covered by an overcoat. On lifting the coat, it was plain to him that his mother was dead, perhaps from a stroke or heart attack, but as her face was fully revealed, it was clear that she had been brutally beaten. Not knowing quite what to do, he immediately rang the family doctor to explain what had happened, and in turn the doctor immediately contacted the police. On their arrival at the house, they found that Ethel's attacker had hit her violently around the head and then strangled her, which was confirmed by the doctor when he examined the corpse. Such was the ferocity of the attack that there was blood splattered on the chair, the floor, and all over the walls. As was usual, the police immediately started house-to-house inquiries, starting with Ethel's next-door neighbours by the name of Lillian and Harold Woodfield. They were sister and brother, and a second brother named Edward, usually called Ted for short, lived a short way away with his wife in nearby Southmead Road. Ted had known Ethel for many years, and had often borrowed small amounts of money from her, and because of this he was high on the list of potential suspects. And so it was that first thing the next morning he had a knock on the door from a Detective Sergeant Cox. On hearing the murder, his reaction was that of shock and sorrow for the old lady's demise, saying that it was the first he had heard about it. He agreed to go with the detective to the local police station, where he was greeted by Superintendent Phillips. When Ted was asked about his movements the previous day, he said that he had spent the afternoon in bed. He was warned by Phillips that Hewenden Road was a small street with only a few houses, and if he had been seen in the area, it soon would be found out. At this point, the suspect started to cry and sob, burying his head in his hands. When he had composed himself a bit, he exclaimed, "A mad impulse came over me to do it. I will tell you everything." The previous day had not been a good one for Ted Woodfield. Like Fred Worth, he also worked at the same factory in Filton, which had led him to having a bad case of dermatitis, which had resulted in his face being covered by an unsightly red rash, which gave the assumption to his fellow workers that he had venereal disease, which caused a large amount of mockery. As a result of this teasing, he handed in his notice in July 1950, but a couple of months later he was missing his previous income and asked his former employers if he could have his old job back. By all accounts, he had been a good worker, but his bosses politely explained that his old job had been filled by someone else, and that currently there were no vacancies, but would inform him if a position came up. Ted subsequently became an angry and depressed individual. Upset by her husband's change of mood and behaviour, his wife, Catherine, left a dejected Ted at home that day, while she went out to her usual work. That morning, Ted went to the Labour Exchange in his quest for a job, and on the way home called into a local pub where he had a couple of pints. After he'd had some lunch at home, it came to him that it might be a good idea to go and see Mrs. Worth to see if he could borrow some money from her, even though he still owed her £1. He picked up a heavy lemonade bottle and walked over to Mrs. Worth's house and knocked on the door. As she opened it, he reached into his pocket as if to get out his wallet, intending to give the impression that he was there to repay her. He was invited into the house and walked with the old lady into the living room, and in his own words, a mad impulse came over him, whereby he reached into his pocket for the lemonade bottle with which he hit the victim over the head. Stunned by the blow, Mrs. Worth reached for her chair, where Ted hit her again and again. He admitted his actions to the police, but did not think that he had used excessive force, and did not feel that it would render the lady unconscious, as she apparently pleaded to him to stop. Ted had crossed a line, and fearing his actions would be reported to the police, he put on a pair of gloves that he had in his pocket, putting his hands around her neck and squeezing the very life out of her. Now that he had silenced his victim, Ted made a hurried search of the house, in the process of which he stole a gold watch, some binoculars, as well as all the money he could find in her handbag. During his walk home, he discarded the bottle and gloves, which were probably stained with blood. Once at home, he hid the watch and binoculars in the back garden, and then calmly prepared the evening meal, as if nothing had happened. That evening after supper, he and his wife went out to the pub and had several drinks each, all at the expense of Mrs. Worth's money. After this full confession, he was charged with murder by the police and was committed for trial at Bristol Assizes on the 22nd of November 1950 before Mr. Justice Devlin. His defence counsel was a Mr. Caswell, who did his best to convince the jury that his client was insane at the time of the murder. Caswell did not call Ted to the stand, instead describing him as a confused individual, producing numerous witnesses who attested that the accused had acted out of character and was normally calm and collected, as well as not having a temper. Apparently, it was claimed, he had a fear of the sight of blood, so much so that the sight of a car accident he had seen left him feeling quite sick. It was disclosed in court that Ted had a past history of mental instability. Both his aunt and grandmother had spent periods of time in asylums, and his mother was described as being delusional at times. 3 years earlier, the defendant claimed that he had bent over one day and he felt what he described as a click in his head, which had left him with double vision for some time afterwards. Medical examination revealed that he had hardened arteries. At the time, there was a benchmark for determining insanity, which was known as the Macnaghten Rules, which was established in 1843 as a result of the trial of Daniel Macnaghten for the murder of Edward Drummond. Macnaghten was suffering from delusions of persecution at the time he committed the murder, and as a result of the trial and subsequent acquittal, it was established that for a defence on the grounds of insanity to be successful, it had to be clearly demonstrated that the accused at the time of committing the crime was suffering from such mental impairment and was not aware of his or her actions and was unable to distinguish between right and wrong. The medical specialists that gave evidence at Woodfield's trial had differing opinions about his mental health, and none of them would go as far as saying that his condition brought him within the Macnaghten Rules. For the defence, the family doctor would only go as far as saying that there was certainly some mental impairment or instability which could push the defendant to violence if he was under stress. The prosecution would not go as far as stating that, whereas the defendant might be more liable to stress than most people. He was fully capable of understanding his actions and the inevitable consequences that would follow. In his summing up to the jury, the judge maintained that Woodfield's sudden impulse, hitherto out of character for a mild-mannered person, was sufficient evidence of diminished responsibility, and that he was not in his right mind when he murdered Mrs. Worth. The judge felt that Woodfield knew exactly what he was doing, and that his actions were wrong, but was not able to refrain because of his mental instability. The jury quite understandably felt that due to the conflicting medical evidence that had been presented, chose to ignore any suggestion of insanity. Woodfield had purposely armed himself with a lemonade bottle when he went to Mrs. Worth's house, his intentions being premeditated. The fact that he had disposed of the bottle and gloves, plus the fact that the proceeds of the robbery had been hidden away in the garden of his house to avoid detection, suggested that he was more than aware of his actions. The jury deliberated for more than 3 hours before agreeing on their verdict, which was guilty, as opposed to guilty but insane. Nowadays, the crime might be interpreted as manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, but this was the 1950s, and there were no grounds for appeal. So it was that Edward Woodfield, aged 49, was executed at Bristol Prison on the 14th of December 1950. So, John, what are your conclusions?
When studying these murders, one factor springs to mind. In many cases, the murderer handed himself into the authorities or quickly admitted the crime. This reveals that society's norms had an extraordinary hold on people's behaviour. Even though they were facing the gallows, they calmly told the police the whole story. There was no talk in those days of cooperating with the police as a means of escaping the hangman's noose. The methods of attaining evidence would horrify people today. Confessions could be attained by the police writing down confessions and encouraging the suspect to sign on the dotted line. It would be years before tape recorders would be allowed in the room. The discovery of DNA and its use in criminal investigation was still the subject of science fiction. It is one of the strange aspects of human behaviour that advances in science match our need to engage in judicial murder. There was the question of insanity in the family, as his aunt and grandmother had both been committed to the asylum. Also, his mother was known to suffer from delusions, but the medical experts were divided as to his mental health, thus showing that it was a case of you pays your money and makes your choice. Let us look at it from the point of view of a juryman. This is probably your first experience of a proper trial. You are frequently sent out as the two sides battle over procedural rules. But a few things are clear. You know that an unemployed so-and-so has not used his time to find gainful employment, but has spent the afternoon in the pub before attacking a defenceless elderly woman with a lemonade bottle, which he had brought with him. In addition, she lent him money, as he was down on his luck. Sympathy would be in short supply.